I find right now, coming out of COVID, people are hesitant to have high expectations for their talent, hesitant to have high expectations for their leadership. But when I look at the flip side, when people have had high expectations, folks rise to them. And I think we could have higher expectations on what does it mean with like transparency with AI and what we're doing with our models. What does it mean in terms of having ethical AI? What does it mean about taking care of our workforce and thinking about upskilling and reskilling? And can we have high expectations and think about the talent and have a talent strategy that we layer on with our AI strategy or our overarching business strategy?
Yeah.
And I think it's okay for talent to have high expectations of their leaders, that they're going to have a vision and they're going to be thinking about these things.
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder and CEO of Augmented AI, and I'm excited that you're tuning in to the Shift AI podcast, a show that explores what it takes to thrive and adapt to the changing workplace in the digital age of remote work and AI. In today's episode, I'm thrilled to have Christy Johnson as our guest. Christy is the CEO of Artemis Connection, a strategy consulting firm that's revolutionizing traditional consulting models by emphasizing flexibility and human potential. She's also a former McKinsey consultant and currently teaches entrepreneurship at the University of Washington. If you're interested in how companies can create more flexible, inclusive workplaces while maintaining high performance and are curious about the intersection of AI and human talent, you won't want to miss this conversation. We also want to send out a special thank you to Augmented AI for sponsoring this episode. This is going to be a great show, and we're super excited to have Christy on today. We can't wait to learn more from her. Let's get to it. Right, Christy, welcome to the Shift AI podcast. I am super excited to have you on today. We're going to dig into a bunch of things. Thanks for joining.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm a huge fan of your show.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, there's going to be some fun stuff that we get into today. But first, as always, I just want to read back your background a little bit. And I want you to tell me and make sure that I get it right. One of the things that I noticed in your resume that's really interesting is that you were a high school math teacher, economics and math and history. And so that's kind of the starting point. But from there, you went to McKinsey and you were an engagement manager at McKinsey and did a lot of work in healthcare, education. You were part of startups. So you were at small companies that were going from 0 to 1. You were also at big companies as well, big manufacturing companies. You were a consultant at Point B, vice president at Flextronic. You were a Stanford grad and also did some work as a course facilitator at Stanford. And I noticed that now you're doing a bunch of work with entrepreneurs at the University of Washington. And I want to talk about that with you as well. But really, your day job is the CEO of Artemis Connection, and it's a boutique strategy and consulting firm. We're going to probably dive deep into a little bit about what you guys do, but I just wanted to make sure I got most of it right. Am I close?
You're close. You're close. I love it. You hit the highlights. And I always like to mention too, I have 3 kids, so that's another job that you can layer in there as well.
That is another job. That is another job for sure. Well, I want to talk a little bit about before the kids, like where you grew up, what part of the world you grew up in, and also your early days of working. Like, what was your first job where you actually got money in exchange for work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am from Washington State. Actually, had somebody tease me about this yesterday. They're like, a 360 phone number. That's like a commitment. You really did grow up here. So I grew up north of Bellingham in a little town called Ferndale. It's up in Whatcom County. So about 10 minutes from the Canadian border. And, I have always loved working. I think it's more the problem solving part is what I've been driven to and drawn to. And the first things that I remember getting paid for, it was silly stuff. Like I'd convince my sister that we should have an art gallery and then we'd get our grandpas and our aunties and everyone else to come, buy art that we put up on the wall. And then babysitting from a small town, like that's something that you can easily do and had on a really ongoing basis. And then I actually had a job at a recycling company that was thinking about new spaces that they wanted to get into during high school. And so they had me writing business plans on, should they be getting into composting or organic fertilizers or other things around that space. Yeah. And that was probably my big office job, my first office job.
You've always been so entrepreneurial. Were your parents business people? Like, what did they do for a living?
Yeah, it's so funny, right? So I'm a blend of both of them. So my father was an entrepreneur growing up. You know, he did really well. He had some years of struggle, and I think those years of struggle happened when I was a tween, and I was like, I'm not going to do that to my family. And here we are now. And then my mom was an educator, so she taught highly
Okay.
capable students and elementary school, and she loves teaching. And so I have that blend of both of them, which is funny to see now.
Yeah. So help me understand how you went from a teacher teaching math and economics to somebody working at McKinsey. That was an interesting jump. I mean, I mean, I know you went to Stanford, so you're very bright, but what was that? How did that manifest itself?
I know, right? Like, who would have thought? Well, I think the common thread, so I really love solving problems, and I like hard problems. And then I've always been interested in future of work. I liked sci-fi growing up, those kinds of
Yeah.
things. And so economics, like you're thinking about where the world's going, you're looking at trends. And what I started to realize as I was delving more into economics and kind of future work and innovation is a lot of this actually depends on human capital. And
Yeah.
I think with some of it growing up in a small town, it can be really inconsistent. I was very fortunate to have some incredible teachers, both at Ferndale and then I did my undergrad at Western. Had some amazing professors there. But it was like, oh, it's pretty inconsistent. And then when I started to look at future work, and this is a long time ago now, but you could see STEM was going to be important. And for most of the STEM disciplines, you need math. And math is one of those subjects that's inconsistently taught. And in particular, I found a lot of women, BIPOC students, people from lower income just didn't find math as interesting or too hard or too scary. And so the initial goal of me, like naive early 20-year-old, was let's go teach math and economics in a way that's really engaging and opens up human productivity and potential. So that's how I ended up in the classroom. And I loved my time in the classroom. It's still the hardest job I've ever had, which surprises people sometimes because I worked at some tough places, including a private equity-backed portfolio company. But I think it was just the importance of the role and the challenges of being in a system where all of humanity is coming together and realizing that we need the public, private, the social sector collaborating in order to solve some of these problems like public education. So that led me to go back to school to do an MBA. And it was a mentor, a professor of mine, who suggested an MBA instead of a master's in education or a PhD. And I applied to Stanford on a whim, truly my husband saying, you tell your students to apply to their dream school, why don't you? Never thinking I would get in, but I did. And I debated going. I actually was also accepted at UW. So I debated between UW and Stanford for quite a while and decided
Both good schools.
Both good schools. I know. And it's really fun now that I get to be at the University of Washington helping students. So the thing then switching over to consulting was really wanting to have systematic impact. And, in many ways, like strategies applied economics. And then to execute a strategy, you need people to do things. And so that's where that kind of teaching element ends up coming into play. Although the thing that's funny, I think this was my hardest adjustment when I was first at McKinsey. I feel like when I was teaching economics and math, I was trying to take complex topics and make them really accessible. And sometimes in consulting, you're taking things that are relatively simple and making them complex. So it's a little bit different.
For sure. It is a little bit different. Well, it's interesting too, when we last spoke about your time at McKinsey and now your founding and CEO position at Artemis, there was and I know you did a lot in between, but the transition from being a consultant to starting your own company, like philosophically, there was some things that made you make that transition. Can you talk a little bit about that, about like why you decided to kind of go from business consulting into what you're doing? I mean, you're still business consulting, but there's a kind of approach and there's intention around how you're doing it that may be a little bit different than what you experienced in some of these bigger companies. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I had the great fortune of being introduced to entrepreneurship while I was doing my MBA. So the dean at Stanford lectured my class that we weren't getting a master's in entrepreneurship. It was a master's in business administration. But I was able to see how creative it is. And I was like, gosh, why did nobody ever talk to me about like how fun that this is? And at the same time, I was getting some mixed messages around like, how would you do a startup if you wanted to have a family, right? Because, you're going to have to be up coding until midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., whatever it takes. And I'm a big family person. And so then it's interesting. I go into consulting. I'm at McKinsey. I worked a lot of hours. I mean, it's pretty regular expectation. It's 60 to 100-hour weeks. You travel a lot at the drop of the hat. I had an international project where I could come home like once a month. There all these things that were really intense. But I love the work, and I love helping clients. Right? There's amazing leaders within companies trying to get things done, and they need an outside in point of view sometimes, or they just need some leverage and some support. And that's the role that strategy consultants play. And so the problem I became obsessed with is, why does it have to be an either or? So could you still do hardcore, rigorous work, and serving executives in a strategy consulting role is hardcore work, and also allow for flexibility? And does that open up maybe human potential, human capital, knowledge that you wouldn't have access to? Because, if you're going to solve hard problems, you need diverse, creative, inspired teams working on them. And so it was really about that. I was like, I see a lot of primarily women who are in caregiving roles, so taking care of children or aging parents that want to work, but the workplace doesn't allow for flexibility. That's too bad. I see a lot of executives who need help problem solving and can't find good talent. It feels like there's a way to solve for some of that.
Yeah. And so Artemis kind of came out of that thought, and talk to us a little bit about the business and about how that's shaping up and who you've been able to recruit to be part of your rockstar team.
Yeah. Well, the recruiting part, it's all grown through referrals, and the caliber of the people that are referred to us. I mean, it blows my mind, and it's so fun, right? I'll talk to these people. So, former McKinsey, Bain, BCG, if you're familiar with that kind of strategy consulting firm, people in tech who have worked in tech for a long time, might be engineers, might be devs, people who have been in private equity or in finance, who have been structuring deals and thinking about growth and innovation. And there's kind of a common theme. So one would be around wanting to have impact. And sometimes in big organizations, as people get more senior, they're like, I'm spending half my time politicking, right? I don't want to do that. I don't want to do governance committees. I want to be having an impact. I want to be solving problems that matter. So that was one big theme. There's a second theme around learning. And so people feeling like, gosh, I'm kind of maxed out, right? Or the things that I'm doing, it's more turn the crank because I'm expected to grow a business a certain percentage year over year. But I want to be thinking about AI. I want to be thinking about, quantum, like these other things that are going to matter. And it's just not really in the purview of my job. So is there a way that I can do some of that? And then the last part's really around flexibility. So people that have other responsibilities outside of work, they work super, super hard whenever they're on. But when they're off, they need to be off. And so what we looked at here were other industries where that's happened. There used to be job shares at companies like Starbucks and Clorox where people would be VPs. So they'd be managing a P&L, they'd be managing a big team. We also looked at like emergency room or ICUs. So that's like a super intense experience. You have something you're taking care of for the family, you're trying to help a patient, but you don't have physicians working 24/7. So if you have good communication protocols, really clear handoffs, and super smart, committed people, then you can actually solve the problem for the patient. So that's kind of what we translated into the business world.
So how did that play out in terms of policy within the company and culture? Because I think that is just there's such an untapped pool of talent out there. A lot of women, a lot of men too, that, want flexibility, but you're right that it's not getting tapped because of a variety of issues around culture. And so how did you think about that, like in the business, and make sure that you kind of had the room there for people to be able to grow and have impact, but also have time for themselves and their family?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a giant dork, as you probably have already figured out. So I like research. And there's a McKinsey Global Institute report about how much GDP we're missing worldwide. This is dated now. So it's 10 years ago. They estimated it was $1.27 trillion we're missing worldwide because of people being underemployed or out of the workforce. So this piece on flexibility, there's certainly kind of people in caregiving roles. I'm actually increasingly seeing dads want this. And also it's really fun being with students. I'm actually, for the first time, seeing more MBA students, both at Stanford and at University of Washington, saying, hey, I'm a guy and I want to have a family someday. And like, what does that mean for my career?
Yeah.
So I think that actually helps advance the conversation a lot. There's this other component around flexibility focused on geography. So pre-COVID, 3% of professional jobs were distributed or remote. And during COVID, I think we realized that we could do a lot more in a distributed environment, but we're seeing an increasing return to office, right? Wasn't it Amazon this week that's like, we're going to make sure people aren't coming in just for the coffee. We're going to actually check how long you're in office. So that geographic flexibility is interesting. And what does that open up? And then this trend that I'm keeping a really close eye on right now, because I think it's going to catch people off guard, is I'm seeing more of a desire for a portfolio career is how I'm thinking about it, which is, and I think some of this comes from, our younger generation and what they lost during COVID. They lost their graduations. They lost their proms. They realized maybe there's no guarantee. And therefore, they aren't willing to do maybe the 60 to 100-hour weeks that some of us were able to do. And they want a portfolio career. So they're like, I'm an artist, right? Or I want to travel. And I'll work super hard when I'm on, but you're going to get like 40 to 50 hours a week. You aren't going to get the 60 to 100. So how do we deal with that as a society and as a workforce and allow for it to happen? I see quite a few companies try to control it. What we've done at Artemis is like, let's all just be direct and honest about what's going on, where our time's going, what our priorities are. And then from a culture standpoint, you have to be really, really intentional. And you can be super data driven with this. And actually the tech's making it easier, some of the AI tools, for the coordination to happen. Because you want the humans to be able to do the things only humans can do and minimize friction in other places, and then be really intentional with how we're working together.
Before we go further with the interview, I want to take a moment to tell you about one of our podcast sponsors, Augmented AI, and how they are transforming businesses with Gen AI solutions. Augmented AI specializes in helping organizations uncover and address internal workflow challenges that Gen AI can solve. Their comprehensive process starts by identifying and prioritizing business problems, and then assessing each based on value, effort, and risk. Once a problem is selected, the Augmented AI team tests and validates the solution to ensure that it works. Only after this thorough validation do they draft technical requirements, which serve as a blueprint for building and deploying the solutions. The real beauty of partnering with Augmented AI is that they don't just stop at strategy and feasibility studies. They actually stand up the solutions and manage them for you so you can focus on what you do best. If you're interested in experiencing this innovative approach to deploying Gen AI solutions, visit simplyaugmented.ai and click on the Learn More button. That's simplyaugmented.ai. Now back to the episode.
Well, let's talk about that, because within that context of working like that, some of these tools like AI and this future vision where we have agents working for us and doing things for us and allowing us to be more creative. I mean, the optimistic vision is that we don't lose our jobs and the robots don't take over. The optimistic vision is that we all start doing things that are more impactful. And so how do you think about that, whether it's like all the new tech that you've been doing research on? How is that going to impact the future of work?
Yeah, I think the new tech, and it's always good to like think through the pros and the cons of any new technology, but I do think it does open up a lot of possibilities and opportunities, provided people are curious and excited about learning, and then leadership is really intentional about setting a vision and building trust and making sure you have the right peoples in the right role. So one example, there's this company called Odetta AI. I love this company. The founder comes from actually more of like a global development in really impoverished areas. But what she did with low code and no code is she built a great company that taps into labor in Pakistan, Afghanistan, places where women traditionally don't have a lot of options, and activates them to be doing things with AI, with low code, with no code. And she's built a great business without a technical co-founder. She's not technical herself. So, 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been possible. But now we see something like that in place. And then she's also like constantly staying on top of what's happening with AI, because she knows it's going to disrupt some of the work that they were doing before. But how does she engage her workforce to be excited about that and problem solve with her instead of scared about what the technology might be doing to them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And along similar lines, I wonder if that's changing the way that you teach entrepreneurship at the University of Washington. Like, what do these students, do these students have more tools now to start different kinds of businesses that they otherwise wouldn't have started? Are they asking questions about that? Are they more curious because of these tools? Tell me about that. Like, what are you hearing out there with the younger entrepreneurs?
I mean, I love students and younger entrepreneurs. The great thing about the students is they're always experimenting with the technology, right? I mean, I feel like TikTok I saw way before other people had it on their radar because the young ones were using it. So the same with AI and the technology and the tools. I think that in some ways it's good to experiment, which when you're a student, you have more opportunity to do that. And the low code, the no code, the AI, it does open up ways to do things. It also is great for like brainstorming, right? And just some of the things that can be helpful. It does still require critical thinking because you do have to question what you're getting out of the technology and the AI and make sure that, you're not having a delusion or anything like that. The part that I wish I saw even more of, though, is stepping back and thinking a little bit bigger picture and long term. So even at the University of Washington, this is a top school, right? I think sometimes people forget that in terms of patents and innovations and R1 grants. This is
spin-outs.
It's
huge.
the leading public university for those sorts of things. And how do we get more collaboration happening? So how do we get the business students interacting with the amazing students in public health or in the computer science department or mechanical engineering? How do we make all of that easier and more natural? And, there's ways that like the technology can help with that. I think this is other part of just looking at some of what the federal and the state government is signaling as priorities and when there's investment happening there, because AI is definitely part of it, but there's like adjacent parts of AI. So how are we going to generate all the energy it takes to run these models? Like that's a business opportunity for folks, right? And so how do we get students thinking bigger and about the broader ecosystem?
And now, before we dive deeper, I want to take a quick moment and tell you a little bit about one of our podcast partners. As a listener of this show, I know you're trying to stay on top of all things AI and tech, which is why you have to check out the amazing GeekWire podcast, produced by GeekWire and hosted by Todd Bishop. It's a treasure of insights featuring industry leaders and the latest tech trends that are shaping our world, and the perfect companion podcast to shift AI. GeekWire podcast is where technology meets curiosity and covers the world of technology, startups, and geek culture. Expand your tech horizons and join the conversation. Tune into the GeekWire podcast today, a perfect complement to our own discussions here. Don't miss out. Follow the GeekWire podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite listening app. Now back to the episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you touched on this before around mentorship at Stanford, but you're also a mentor to a lot of these students too. And I think that there's a lot, I hear out there that mentorship has been lost as everybody had to get sent home during the pandemic, and we're kind of getting back to the office, but it's something that I know apprenticeship and mentorship is something that people really yearn for. So how has that shown up for you throughout your life? And then how do you think about that as an adjunct faculty?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no way I'd be where I am today without incredible mentors and people who apprenticed me. And so I feel a responsibility to pay that forward, as I think all of us do, right? And I think we've all had that moment where somebody notices something in you and they're like, hey, you're really good at this. And for me, it was an economics class in undergrad where a professor said, hey, you just seem to have a knack for this. I'm like, really? It's just like math with people. And she's like, I know, but like not everybody can figure it out. So noticing that in people feels good, right? And it feels really great for the person. And again, it can help calibrate and spot opportunities. And then I do think that throughout my career, I've had the great fortune of having people create opportunities for me too, like things I shouldn't have done. I didn't know what I was doing, right? And putting me into a big role. And then, it's funny, I've asked some of these people later, like, why did you do that? And they just said, I was very coachable. I'm open to feedback. Probably comes from teaching high school. It's my first job. And so that they actually appreciate like seeing that growth, and that they also end up learning a lot too, because I'll try to find things that they may not know about and be able to share it back. So it's a mutual kind of like learning opportunity is how I tend to think about it. And then we get pushed on this because the strategy consulting model depends on an apprenticeship. And so how do you do that in a distributed and a remote environment? And it's tough, right? I mean, I will say coming out of COVID, we found some of our younger talent just didn't even know what work was, right? So how do you help people learn what work is in a remote environment? It does come down to some of that intentionality. I am finding post-COVID, and I tend to see this a little bit stronger with my young women, but also just women in general, having a harder time wanting to asking for help or asking for advice, more being used to the ones that are giving advice and are giving help. So I think the more we can realize, hey, we all have a lot to learn. Like AI is transforming things really quickly. We also have just a host of events that are creating uncertainty. Might as well all own up to that and help each other out. And then we're going to end up in a better spot. And I would like to see more of a culture of mentorship and apprenticeship kind of at all levels, at all ages. I think we need it.
Can we talk more about younger women and the kinds of mentorship that they need in order? Like, what are some of the things that you're seeing out there that's different, for young women? And, as you've been through these big companies and be, pushed into large opportunities, how do you think about what's some advice out there for young women entrepreneurs or young women that want to get into the business world? There's a lot of women that listen to this show. So tell me what your advice would be.
Yeah, well, and I think men can help with this too. So men have been some of my most helpful mentors. And so, there's this mantra of like, if you see it, you can be it. I absolutely think that that's important, that we need representation. And also like we can learn a lot from other people who have been successful. So one thing I think is critically important for women to be thinking through is who has actually achieved something in a spot where they have aspirations, and can they learn from that person, right? And I think the more clear they can be on, hey, I want your advice, I'm trying to figure this thing out, the better. So for example, one of the things I do in my class is I'm like, let me show you all the things men have asked me for this week, because I get a lot of bold asks every week.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that we need to be like men, but it's also okay for us to ask. And, if somebody's super busy, make it clear and specific, because then people can help you get what you want. Or if they can't, that's okay too. So I think that's kind of like one piece.
Yeah.
I think there's this second part that because so much of caregiving and responsibilities outside of work continue to fall on women, that it can sometimes be harder to figure out what you want, because like that requires space, right? And if you're constantly being interrupted, or if you have a sick older family member and caregiver situations falling through and you're navigating that while also trying to figure out work, where do you have space to figure out what you want? And so that I think is just really important, is continuing to encourage people to think through what it is that they want. And then this last part, and this is where I think the mentoring really comes into play, or the cohort model. I mean, things that can be wonderful about being back in school. Go find a community of folks that want to make the world a better place, or are trying to solve hard problems similar to yours, where you can walk along beside each other and be really real. Because, I mean, Buzz, you're building something. It's hard some days. And it's really nice to be like, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm overwhelmed, or I want to quit and go get a job, right? I want somebody to tell me what to do, because entrepreneurs don't have that. So I think if we can be real and find communities where people are actually building, not just talking about it, and walk alongside each other, that can make a difference.
Yeah, I love that. I love that a lot. Before I ask my last question to you, can you tell a little story about some of the things that men ask you that you tell your younger entrepreneurs to kind of, about?
I'm only laughing because this is where like sometimes my husband and my kids will pop up with certain voices. They know it's going to be like big, bold asks. I mean, on the business side, and again, I'm super fortunate, right? I have this amazing, awesome, helpful network, and it includes a lot of investors. So I have a lot of entrepreneurs who are like, give me feedback on my pitch deck, or introduce me to these investors, right? It's a lot easier if they actually include the pitch deck or a little blurb about them and are willing to have a conversation before. And I love it when that happens, right? If people are working on an innovative idea and I can connect them with funders who want to fund that, that's great, right? So I do tend to get, 4 to 10 asks a week, 90% men on something like that. The second part is around talent. So I I know some really great, awesome people. And if somebody's looking for a job or wants to work at a place and I can connect them with people who work there, like that's a win for everybody. So I do tend to get a lot of like, hey, do you know who the hiring manager is? Or I already know who the hiring manager is. Can you put in a good word for me? And I will only do that if I know the person and can speak to them. So I will say no if I can't. So that I think is another thing that I get asked for. And then there's funny random things like, my son needs an internship, or where the kids move into Seattle. Do you know anybody who might have a short-term lease? Or even like, I'm looking to date somebody. It seems like you know interesting people. We need some of your friends. So it's like a really fun, eclectic range of things I get asked for. But it's probably 90% male, amazing. 10% female each week.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I have kids too, and I have a son and 2 daughters, and I'm trying to coach all of them to ask, but to also be prepared when they ask. And it's hard for young people to feel the confidence to be able to network. So I think it's definitely good advice.
Yeah, I think, and then also the follow through, right? Because somebody's taking a risk. Like I'm introducing you to people I trust in my network, and I'm putting in a good word for you. So then like, show up and follow through, right? Every once in a while, I'll get feedback, which always stings a little bit when somebody's like, well, that student wasn't prepared or they didn't show up on time, right? And I was like, oh, shoot, like you missed an opportunity there. I was trying to create one for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I appreciate you listening to other episodes of the show, that I always ask the same question at the end. So I'm going to ask you too. When you think about the future of work, AI, remote work, all the things that you're thinking about work in the future, what are the 2 words that you would use to describe the future of work? And then you can elaborate.
High expectations. And I bring that up because I think a lot of this actually comes from my work with executive teams. And I find right now, coming out of COVID, people are hesitant to have high expectations for their talent, hesitant to have high expectations for their leadership. But when I look at the flip side, when people have had high expectations, folks rise to them, right? And I think we could have higher expectations on what does it mean with like transparency with AI and what we're doing with our models. What does it mean in terms of having ethical AI? We can have high expectations around that. What does it mean about taking care of our workforce and thinking about upskilling and reskilling? And can we have high expectations and think about the talent and we should have a talent strategy that we layer on with our AI strategy or our overarching business strategy.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay for talent to have high expectations of their leaders, that they're going to have a vision and they're going to be thinking about these things.
Yeah, I love that. In a world where everyone's talking about how the robots are going to take our jobs, your perspective is really about people and about having high expectations of people, but also treating people the right way. So I really, really appreciate the conversation, and I'm excited that you're on the show today. I hope we can do this again. So Christy, thank you for being on the Shift AI podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, Boaz.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Such a pleasure to have Christy as our guest on today's episode. She brings a refreshing perspective on the future of work by creating flexible environments that unlock human potential. If you want to stay connected with Christy and learn more about her work in reimagining the future of consulting, you can find her on LinkedIn. I continue to be amazed by the guests we've had on the show, and I'm excited about the ones joining us in the near future. I truly appreciate you spending your time with us. Thank you for listening to this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to the Shift AI podcast for more exciting interviews, and to the Augmented AI Weekly newsletter for updates on how AI can help you scale your business. The Shift AI podcast is syndicated by GeekWire, and we're grateful to have the show sponsored by Augmented AI. Our theme music was created by Dave Angel.